of Dialectics and Accelerationism. By Aldous Huxley, not actually. Also known as cyberpire. Communism is for us not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism a real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The conditions of this movement result from the premises now in existence. Marx, the German ideology. It is fairly well accepted that accelerationism finds its first, crude, expression in Marx. This much seems uncontroversial. The question on free trade remains a regularly quoted source for the earliest expressions of accelerationism, but it should be accepted at the same time that Marx's assertions here are strictly utilitarian. He poses the acceleration of capitalism as the means to a political end. But Marx wasn't simply a statesman. He wasn't interested strictly in political matters, or even in matters of economy. Marx was, as much as he resisted it, a philosopher first and foremost. He wasn't a mere political theorist, he was a metaphysician. A metaphysician coming out of the tradition of Hegel, no less. Let us set aside the political affiliations for a moment. Can it be said that Marx's dialectics, that is, historical materialism, also contains this crude accelerationist expression? Although the question of the relationship between accelerationism and dialectics has yet to be settled, it is my contention that the through line between Marxism and accelerationism in a philosophical sense is not only present, but much less crude than his political conclusions. We will refer almost singularly here to the German ideology, as bridging the gap across Marx's entire philosophical oeuvre is a project which far outscales the scope of this essay. Instead, we will simply look to tether ourselves in an explorable area of the sea of thought. To hone in on this, let us start at the end. Accelerationism, as it has emerged out of the work of Nick Land and the CCIU et al., is unmistakably Deleuzian. Deleuze serves as the central springboard for the cybernetic analysis of technocapitalism. Deleuze is also one of the all-time great polemicists against dialectics. Deleuze sees the folly of dialectics to be its false totalitizing element, its monodimensional approach to ontology. Where, Hegelian, dialectics sees the outside as simply a moment of negation, that is, the outside is only a stage in a process which remains strictly a matter of interiority. Differential ontology sees the outside as both exterior and really different. But for his spectacular effort, Deleuze never leaves the orbit of Hegel. In Difference and Repetition, Deleuze even goes so far as to call negation the inverse image of difference, as if his system is simply another attempt, like Marx before him, to set Hegelian dialectics on its feet. But regardless of which side of the looking glass you stand, one thing is clear: if accelerationism is to stay within the Deleuzian framework, accelerationism seems to have little to gain from engaging with dialectics, either Hegelian or Marxist, and that this whole question might be best answered with cold silence. But before we draw our lines in the sand, let us step back into Marx. The German ideology presents a definition of communism which is strictly separate from the realm of political projects. If communism is not a state of affairs, an ideal to which reality is made to conform to, what could it be other than the real movement of historical materialism? The dialectic movement within the material structures of reality itself? So where does socialism fit into all this? There is a lot of myths about Marx. Perhaps one of the most pernicious is the idea that socialism and communism can be seen as interchangeable terms. Marx did not describe the communists as those people who were looking to implement socialism. In strict opposition to the socialist, the communist is described in terms of negative or anti-praxis. They are only those people who attack the material basis on which the hitherto inevitable fixedness of desires and ideas depended. People through whose historical activity the liquefaction of the fixed desires and ideas is in fact brought about and ceases to be an impotent moral injunction. Socialism, as far as it is understood as generally as a positive political project, and specifically as a society in which the proletariat has seized ownership over the means of production, seems to a certain degree antagonistic to the aims of communism. Socialism and communism can only line up so long as the real movement of history supports the socialist analysis. That is, if the real movement of history works against these positive political projects, if the material conditions of society have changed such that the previously analyzed relationship of proletariat and bourgeois no longer exist, does not this correlation between communism and socialism necessarily fall apart? Isn't it undeniable that this conception of socialism has become nothing more than an empty ideal, a state of affairs to be established? So how did Marx, seemingly against his metaphysical beliefs, come to advocate for the state of affairs that is socialism? This is where dialectics finally enters the fray. To be clear, there isn't simply one true Marxism. Marx himself underwent all sorts of philosophical and political metamorphoses during his life, and Marxists have taken his ideas and applied them to all sorts of idiosyncratic subjects in idiosyncratic ways. Keeping this in mind, we can generalize somewhat. Let us say that Marxism tends to split itself into two main branches. Firstly, we have political Marxism, that is, the utilitarian, moral, project of fashioning the material conditions of society, most often understood as socialism. Secondly, we have philosophical Marxism, that is, the metaphysical, amoral, research program which seeks to understand and change the material conditions both as they exist and as they move through history, something Marx gives fullest expression as communism. There is the analysis of capitalism, that being the assessment that capitalism will collapse into the more free society of socialism, and there is also the analytical tools that Marx uses to reach these conclusions, those being dialectics, the assertion of strictly material relations of history, ect. I have a strong hunch that a spectacular amount of effort is wasted in attempting to justify Marx's analysis of history rather than the analytical tools he developed. It is the metaphysics which should be salvaged from Marx, not the politics. Imagine an unrefined example here. A man has a formula, say, the formula for velocity. If this man has the incorrect information for the delta of speed and time, the predictive element of the formula is naught. Say his prediction he makes with the formula is wrong, can we simply conclude that the formula itself is at fault? It would seem like there are two elements which need verification, both the validity of the formula, and the validity of the information which the formula treats. If the formula is shown to be valid, why do so many feel the need to jump to defending the faulty conclusions people drew from that formula? Let's say things how they are. Marx could have been totally wrong about socialism, and historical materialism could still be the correct metaphysical approach to reality. Communism is a metaphysical research program. Socialism, as defined specifically above, has been historically determined as nothing more than an impotent moral injunction. So what happened to get us to the point where things are how they are? Baudrillard gives this a wonderful treatment in Symbolic Exchange and Death. Without lending capital a Marxist's intuition, even though Marx did everything he could to alert capital to what was waiting for it, if it persisted in playing on the terrain of production, it was heading for its death in the short term. The economy was a fatal trap for capital. Everything happened as if it had clearly understood Marx on this point and had, in consequence, chosen to liquidate production so as to go on to another kind of strategy. In a real way, capital today isn't capital as it was in Marx's time, and based on Marx's own theory we should have been ready to recognize this. We should be naive enough to take Marx at his word. Material analysis is the game here, not socialism, and if socialism is no longer in the material analysis, we should leave it in the past where it lived and died. The new, higher stages of capitalism are as deserving of analysis as the lower ones were in Marx's time, and it is nothing less than a disservice to Marx to claim that material analysis is no longer needed, or that the communist should be subject to the ideal whims of socialist theory, or that a thinker should be elevated to a saint. Could there be anything more disgraceful than a Marxist who wishes to make Marx into an idealist? Take Hegel's assertion that philosophy comes too late to instruct the world what it ought to be. Is this not far more amenable to material analysis than the ideal perversions of St. Karl? Is it not a sad state of affairs where Marxists should be encouraged to read Hegel to bring them back to earth? Hegel's dialectics are a black box. The truths which preceded us are cloaked in the lifeless grey of philosophy, and those which await us are unseen and indeterminate, and in classic Hegelian fashion, we must return to the topic we began with: how does all this relate to accelerationism? For one, accelerationism can be said to have a similar bifurcation which is often conflated, or even denied. Firstly, there is political accelerationism, that is, the utilitarian, moral, project of fashioning the material conditions of society, most often understood under the various acceleration labels: left acceleration, right acceleration, unconditional acceleration, etc. Secondly, we have philosophical accelerationism, that is, the metaphysical, amoral, research program which seeks to understand the material conditions both as they exist and as they move through history. Something Land gives fullest expression as accelerationism. For another, philosophical communism, a historical materialism, a description of a materialism through which substance itself is subject to dialectical forces, a materialism which is incomplete, self-moving, and which is headed to ends which preclude human understanding, a materialism which privileges that which persists through the temporal abolition of the real. This is the same force which Deleuze spoke of in Anti-Oedipus, the process of deterritorialization, the production of clearings over the Cisseus, bodies without organs, the overcoming of internal limits, the becoming of a new earth. In a Hegelian spin, it could even be said that deterritorialization exists as the negative within reterritorialization, as the twofold movement of decoding or deterritorializing flows on the one hand, and their violent and artificial reterritorialization on the other. The insurmountable gaps that surround dialectics provide their soul, their movement. The outside. The outside comes in, and once it's in, it was always there. Every dialectal leap is a practice in retroteleology. It is beyond the veil, in a state of indetermination, until it isn't, and as if by magic, Hegel couldn't help but be fascinated by magic and alien forces. All at once it is concretized, and made subject to science, or, rendered in more elegant terms, the virtual becomes actualized and inscribed on the body of the Cisseus. Although my treatment can't help but slip into reductionism, it should be made explicit that these thinkers are most certainly not saying the same thing. The difference between Hegel and Marx and Deleuze and Land is complex and nuanced and full of productive disjunctions and the like. My position is instead quite modest: the alien forces of negation in Hegel, the historical dialectics in Marx, the forces of deterritorialization in Deleuze, the flux of Heraclitean fire, they are all reactions to the same movement, the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. If you permit me to more slip into reductionism, there is another distinction to explore here. The shadowy border we have drawn between accelerationism and communism has been paralleled by the border drawn between differential ontology and dialectical, historical, materialism. On one side of the mirror, the ontology of difference. God's tally runs over; on the other side, dialectical materialism, his tally runs short. Does the outside represent a positive remainder, or a negative one? Either side knows the figures don't add up, but the question remains, is he in the black or the red? The totality that Deleuze resisted in dialectics isn't a totality which denies the reality of an outside. Dialectics is a totality which inscribes the outside into the very substance of reality. This movement isn't made to reduce the outside, on the contrary. When we look around we find the outside is all around us. Deleuze can answer for this just fine. It takes Hegel to answer for why we find the outside in the inside too. Marx is the critical axis between the two, and it's up to the communist, accelerationist, today to sublate these contradictions and abolish the present state of things.